Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Paul Martinez pressed his back against the rough bark of a Douglas fir, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the shadows move between the trees ahead. His radio crackled with static, the emergency frequency cutting in and out like a dying heartbeat. 3 hours ago, he'd been conducting a routine patrol of the Cascade Wilderness when his gut, that sixth sense that had saved his ass more times than he could count, started screaming. Something was wrong in these woods. Real wrong. The October air bit at his exposed skin, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else. Something metallic and sweet that made his stomach churn. Paul's weathered hands, scarred from 15 years of forest service, fumbled for his binoculars. At 42, he'd seen plenty of weird shit in the backcountry, but this felt different. This felt like being watched by hungry eyes. "Base, this is Ranger Martinez, Sector 7, he whispered into his radio, the device feeling slick with his nervous sweat. "I need immediate backup at coordinates." Static consumed his words, the radio spitting electronic gibberish back at him. Paul's phone showed one bar, then none. The GPS on his Garmin was spinning like a broken compass. Every piece of technology he carried was going haywire, and that crawling sensation between his shoulder blades was getting worse. That's when he saw her. Megan Walsh, 23, blonde hair in a messy bun, wearing that bright red Columbia jacket her mother had described over the phone. She was stumbling through the undergrowth about 200 yards ahead, moving in an odd, jerky pattern that set off every alarm bell in Paul's head. Behind her, barely visible through the tree line, dark figures moved with purpose, too coordinated to be other lost hikers. Paul's instincts screamed run, but his training kicked in. Megan was his responsibility. Her family was counting on him. His own daughter Emma's face flashed in his mind. What if it was her out there? He keyed his radio again. "This is Martinez. I have visual on missing person Megan Walsh, Sector 7, requesting immediate..." The static died. Complete silence filled the airwaves. Paul started moving, his Danner boots finding purchase on the forest floor without conscious thought. 15 years of experience guided him through the trees, staying downwind using available cover. But with every step, that sick feeling in his gut grew stronger. The woods around him felt wrong, too quiet, too still, like nature itself was holding its breath. The figures behind Megan resolved into focus through his binoculars. 3 people in dark clothing moving in formation. One carried what looked like a leather-bound book. Another held something that glinted in the filtered sunlight. Metal, sharp. The third figure moved with an authority that made Paul's skin crawl. These weren't concerned family members. These weren't fellow search and rescue volunteers. Paul's radio suddenly burst to life with a woman's voice clear as crystal. Paul, can you hear us? We've been waiting for you." Ice shot down his spine. The voice wasn't coming through proper emergency channels. It was Megan's voice, but wrong somehow. Too calm, too knowing. And how the hell did she know his name? Through his binoculars, he watched Megan stop walking. She turned, and even at this distance, Paul could see her smile. Not the relief of a lost hiker spotting rescue. Something else entirely. Something that made his mouth go dry with terror. "Paul," the radio crackled again, still in Megan's voice but with an underlying chorus of whispers. "Come join us. Your daughter Emma sends her love." Paul's blood turned to ice water. Emma was safe at home in Bend, 3 hours away. She had to be. He'd kissed her goodbye this morning, promised to help her with algebra homework when he got back from his shift. But how did these people know about her? How did they know anything about his family? The dark figures began moving toward him with renewed purpose, no longer following Megan but hunting him. Paul's training warred with his instincts. Protocol said call for backup, establish communication, assess the threat. But his gut said run like hell. Paul chose to trust his gut. He'd been wrong before, but never about danger. He turned and sprinted deeper into the forest, branches whipping at his face, his duty belt jangling with every step. Behind him, he could hear movement, not crashing through undergrowth like normal people, but smooth, coordinated pursuit, like they knew these woods better than he did, even though he'd patrolled this sector for 5 years. His radio exploded with voices now, dozens of them, men and women and children, all talking at once in languages he didn't recognize, interspersed with English phrases that made his hair stand on end. The trees are watching. Blood for the old ones. He can't hide from what he is. Paul ripped the radio from his belt and hurled it into the undergrowth, but the voices continued, coming from the trees themselves now, or maybe from inside his own head. His vision started to blur at the edges, and he realized he was hyperventilating. Get it together, Martinez. People are counting on you. But when he checked his phone, the screen showed 17 missed calls from his wife, Sarah, all time-stamped hours in the future. The date read October 31st, 2019. Halloween. But this morning had been October 28th. Paul stopped running, his chest heaving, and tried to think rationally. Hypothermia could cause confusion. Dehydration could cause hallucinations. Low blood sugar could make a man see things that weren't there. Except he felt fine physically. Stronger than he had in years, actually, like his body was running on pure adrenaline. Through the trees ahead, he spotted something that made his heart sink. The old Cascade mining camp, abandoned since the 1960s. A collection of rotting wooden buildings that had been off-limits to hikers for decades due to structural instability. But light flickered in the windows. Candlelight, warm and inviting in a way that felt like a trap. His radio, despite being 30 yards away in the brush, crackled one more time. Paul, we have your family. Come to the camp and we'll make an exchange. Don't come, and you'll find pieces of them scattered throughout these woods for the next 50 years. Paul's knees almost buckled. Sarah, Emma, his 8-year-old son Michael. The voices knew about all of them now, speaking their names with casual familiarity that suggested intimate knowledge. But it was impossible. He'd left them safe at home. He'd checked in with Sarah just before his patrol started, hadn't he? Paul tried to remember the morning clearly, but the details kept slipping away like water through his fingers. Had he actually seen Sarah before leaving for work? Had he really kissed Emma goodbye? The harder he tried to focus on the memories, the more they seemed to dissolve. His hands shook as he drew his service weapon, a Glock 22 that felt inadequate against whatever was waiting in that camp. But if his family was really there, if they were really in danger, he had no choice. The buildings looked exactly as they had during his last inspection 6 months ago. Weathered gray wood, broken windows, warning signs posted by the Forest Service. But warm light spilled from every opening, and smoke rose from chimneys that should have been cold for decades. Paul's approach was textbook, cover to cover, weapon ready, constantly scanning for threats. But the closer he got, the more his vision seemed to shift and waver. Sometimes the buildings looked abandoned and rotting. Sometimes they looked newly constructed, painted bright white, with clean glass in the windows and well-maintained walkways. Sometimes they looked like his own house. Through the main building's window, Paul saw them. Sarah, Emma, and Michael, sitting around a familiar kitchen table having dinner like any normal Tuesday night. They looked perfectly fine, healthy, happy, safe. Sarah was laughing at something Michael had said. Emma was showing off a drawing she'd made at school. Paul's relief was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Whatever game these people were playing, whatever they wanted from him, his family was okay. But as he watched, Sarah looked up from her plate and smiled directly at him through the window. Her mouth opened and Megan's voice came out. "Hello, Paul. We've been waiting for you to come home." Emma and Michael turned in unison, their faces blank and expressionless, their eyes reflecting the candlelight like animal eyes in headlights. When they smiled, their teeth were too sharp, too numerous, filling their mouths like rows of broken glass. Paul stumbled backward, his rational mind finally snapping under the pressure. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the weight of his Glock in his hand was real. The cold bite of October air was real. The sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears was real. What the hell was happening to him? If this story is giving you chills, follow for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Paul's situation? Comment below. Behind him, he heard footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. Paul spun around to find the three dark figures from earlier standing at the edge of the clearing. Up close, he could see they were wearing what looked like old Forest Service uniforms, but wrong somehow. Patches that didn't match, badges that weren't regulation, insignia from departments that didn't exist. The leader, a woman with graying hair and eyes that seemed too dark for her pale face, held up a leather-bound book. "Ranger Martinez," she said in a voice that carried decades of authority. "You're late for the ceremony." "What ceremony?" Paul's voice cracked like a teenager's. "What the hell do you people want?" "What we've always wanted," she replied calmly. "What your predecessors gave us willingly. The Watchers in the Pines require sacrifice, Paul. They require blood freely given by those who guard the forest. It's been the arrangement for over a century." Paul's mind reeled. "You're insane. I don't know what kind of cult bullshit this is, but look at your badge, Paul." Against his better judgment, Paul glanced down at his chest. The familiar Forest Service shield was there, but the text beneath it was wrong. Instead of U.S. Forest Service, it read, "Pine Grove Forest, Esther 1892. Below that, in smaller text, "In service to the Watchers." "That's impossible," Paul whispered. "I've worked for the Forest Service for 15 years. I know my own badge." "Have you?" The woman's smile was patient, almost motherly. "Or have you been working for us all along? Tell me, Paul, when did you first start feeling like you didn't quite belong in the normal world? When did you first realize you could sense things others couldn't?" Paul's knees went weak. He had always been different. Even as a kid, he'd known when storms were coming hours before the weather turned. He could find lost pets, sense when avalanche conditions were building, feel the presence of wildlife long before he saw or heard them. His fellow rangers called it experience, intuition, natural talent. But what if it was something else? "The Watchers chose you long ago, Paul," the woman continued. "They've been guiding your steps, shaping your life, preparing you for this moment. Every person you've saved, every life you've protected, it was all to bring you here to this choice." Paul shook his head violently. No, that's not. I have a family, I have a real life. Do you?" The second figure spoke for the first time, a man with Paul's own voice. "Check your phone, Paul. Check your contacts." With trembling fingers, Paul pulled out his iPhone. His contact list was nearly empty, just 3 entries. Base station, emergency services, and the Watchers. No Sarah, no family, no friends, no life outside the forest. His photo gallery showed only pictures of trees, trails, and wildlife. No family vacation shots, no birthday parties, no Christmas mornings, just endless forest scenes stretching back through years of phone upgrades. "This isn't real," Paul said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "You're doing something to my phone, some kind of hacking or—" "Paul." The third figure stepped forward, and Paul's heart nearly stopped. It was himself, an exact duplicate, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same equipment. But this version of Paul looked older, wearier, with eyes that held knowledge Paul didn't want to possess. "I've been you," his doppelganger said quietly. "I've stood where you're standing, felt what you're feeling. The confusion, the terror, the desperate need to believe in a normal life that never really existed. But the Watchers need a forest guardian, Paul. They need someone who can sense danger, who can protect their domain, who can guide the chosen ones to their destiny." "Like Megan?" Paul's voice was barely a whisper. "Like Megan. Like dozens of others over the years. The forest requires sacrifice, Paul. Blood and fear and life force to maintain the balance between worlds. And you've been our recruiter all along." Images flashed through Paul's mind, memories that felt real but impossible. Standing in the same clearing dozens of times before, watching as hikers and campers walked into the abandoned buildings and never came out. Guiding search parties away from the right paths, filing reports that omitted crucial details, always finding logical explanations for the unexplained disappearances. "Every missing person case you've worked," the woman said gently. "Every search that came up empty, every family that never got closure, you were protecting us. You were serving the Watchers." Paul's radio, somehow back on his belt despite him throwing it away, crackled with his own voice. "Base, this is Martinez. Search of Sector 7 complete. No sign of missing hiker Megan Walsh. Recommend expanding search to adjoining areas." But he hadn't made that call. Had he? "The choice is simple, Paul," his doppelganger said. "Accept what you are, and your service continues. Your purpose remains clear, your existence meaningful. Refuse, and..." He gestured toward the buildings. "Take a closer look at your family." Paul approached the window again, dreading what he might see. Sarah, Emma, and Michael were still there, still smiling their two sharp smiles. But now he could see through them, translucent, flickering like projections or mirages. As he watched, they began to fade, their edges dissolving into the candlelight. "They were never real," the woman explained. "Beautiful constructs, born from your deepest desires for normalcy. The Watchers gave you the dream of a family to ease the loneliness of your true purpose. But dreams must end, Paul." Paul felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper. The last vestiges of the man he thought he was crumbled away, leaving only truth in their wake. He was a creature of the forest now, and always had been. The uniform, the badge, the authority, all real, but serving masters older and darker than any government agency. "What happens to Megan?" he asked. "What always happens," his doppelganger replied. "The Watchers feed, the forest is strengthened, and the balance is maintained. Some serve by protecting, others serve by providing. Megan's service will be remembered." Paul looked one last time at the fading specters of his imaginary family. Emma's image flickered and smiled, mouthing words he couldn't hear but somehow understood. "It's okay, Daddy. You're exactly who you're supposed to be." When Paul turned back to face the three figures, his expression had changed. The terror was gone, replaced by something like resignation, something like relief. The weight of pretending to be human was lifted from his shoulders at last. "What do I need to do?" he asked. The woman smiled and handed him the leather-bound book. "Same thing you've always done, Paul. Guard the forest, guide the chosen ones, serve the Watchers. Your shift starts now." Paul opened the book to the first page. Written in his own handwriting were hundreds of names. Hikers, campers, researchers, thrill-seekers. All the people who had disappeared in these woods over the decades. And at the bottom of the current page, in fresh ink, Megan Walsh, October 28, 2019. Below that, a blank line waited for the next name. Paul pulled out his pen, a familiar cross pen that Sarah had given him for their anniversary. Except Sarah had never existed, so where had it come from? And added his signature below Megan's name. Not as a victim, but as a witness, as an accomplice, as a guardian doing his duty. His radio crackled to life. "All units, this is base. Missing hiker Megan Walsh, last seen in Sector 7. Ranger Martinez is coordinating search efforts. All available personnel report to staging area for briefing." Paul keyed his mic with steady hands. "Base, this is Martinez. Beginning systematic search of Sector 7. We'll report findings as search progresses." He looked around the clearing one more time. The abandoned buildings were rotting and empty again, just as they should be. The three figures were gone. His doppelganger had vanished. Only Paul remained, alone in the forest with his true purpose finally clear. Tomorrow, more searchers would come. Well-meaning people looking for Megan Walsh. Paul would guide them through the proper motions, file the appropriate reports, and ultimately lead them away from any real answers. Because that was his job. That was what he'd always done. That was what he was. As Paul walked back through the darkening forest toward his truck, something moved in his peripheral vision. When he turned to look, he saw them. Dozens of pale figures standing motionless among the trees. watching him with dark, ancient eyes. The Watchers, his employers, his true family. Paul nodded respectfully and continued walking. Behind him, the sounds of the forest gradually returned. Birds calling, wind rustling through branches, the normal soundtrack of wilderness life. But underneath it all, barely audible, was something else. Voices whispering in languages older than human civilization, speaking words of approval and welcome. When Paul reached his truck, he paused to look at himself in the side mirror. Same face, same uniform, same badge. But his eyes were different now, darker, older, holding knowledge that no human should possess. He looked like someone who had been on duty for much longer than 15 years. Paul started the engine and began the drive back to the ranger station, where he would file his initial report on the search for Megan Walsh. A search that would continue for days, involve dozens of volunteers, and ultimately find nothing, just like all the others. The radio chattered with updates from other units, coordinates being checked, areas being cleared. Normal Forest Service activity on a normal October evening. Paul drove through it all with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this job for a very long time. In his rearview mirror, the forest watched him go. And somewhere in those depths, the Watchers fed, and the ancient compact between human and inhuman remained unbroken. Paul Martinez, Ranger, U.S. Forest Service. Paul Martinez, Guardian, Servants of the Watchers. Same man, same duty. Different understanding. The road stretched ahead, leading back to his real life. His station, his reports, his purpose. Behind him, the forest kept its secrets, as forests always had, as forests always would. Some things were older than truth. Some duties were older than law. Some watchers were older than time. And Paul had work to do. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories. Follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Megan. I read every single one. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., cutting through the quiet of the Willow Creek Ranger Station like a knife through morning fog. Robert Martinez set down his coffee mug, still steaming with the cheap station brew, and reached for the handset with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been answering emergency calls for 12 years, though his colleagues still treated him like the college boy who'd shown up with a forestry degree and too many theories. Willow Creek Station, Ranger Martinez responding. The voice on the other end was raw with panic, a woman's voice cracking under the weight of terror. My daughter, she's missing, Emily Richardson. She went hiking yesterday afternoon on the Blackwater Trail and never came home. Please, you have to find her. Robert's pen moved across the incident form with mechanical precision, his analytical mind already processing the data. October 15th, 2019. Blackwater Trail, a moderate 4-mile loop that meandered through dense pine and oak with 3 creek crossings and 1 steep elevation gain near Devil's Backbone Ridge. Average hiking time, 3 hours. Weather yesterday, clear 68 degrees, winds light and variable. Ma'am, I need you to slow down. What's your name? Susan Richardson. My daughter Emily. She's 22, blonde hair, about 5'6". She was wearing a red North Face jacket and black hiking boots. She left around 2 p.m. yesterday. Said she'd be back by 6 for dinner. The woman's voice broke. She always calls if she's going to be late. Always. Robert glanced at the wall clock. 14 hours missing. His throat tightened. In his experience, hikers who didn't return within 12 hours were either seriously injured or... He pushed the thought away. Focus on the data. Focus on what you can prove. Did she go alone? Yes, she likes to think when she hikes. She's been stressed about her new job, wanted to clear her head. Oh God, what if she fell? What if she's hurt and... Mrs. Richardson, we're going to find her. I need her vehicle description and where she parked. Blue Honda Civic 2017, license plate. She rattled off the numbers through tears. She always parks at the Blackwater trailhead. Always. After taking the remaining details, Robert hung up and immediately radioed dispatch. The response was predictably bureaucratic. A missing person report would be filed, and if Emily didn't turn up by noon, they'd organize a search party. Standard protocol. But Robert's gut told him noon would be too late. Something about the mother's panic felt different, more urgent than the usual overnight hiking mishaps. He grabbed his gear bag from the equipment room. Motorola T600 radio, first aid kit, emergency blanket, headlamp, GPS unit, bear spray, and 2 energy bars that tasted like cardboard but could keep you going for hours. His hands moved through the familiar routine while his mind worked the problem. Blackwater Trail wasn't particularly dangerous. A few steep sections, some loose rock, but nothing that should stop an experienced hiker. Emily's mother had mentioned she hiked regularly. The drive to the trailhead took 23 minutes on winding Forest Service roads, his white Ford Ranger kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still morning air. Robert's radio chattered with routine morning traffic, campers needing firewood permits, reports of minor bear activity near Cascade Falls, normal October business in the Cascade National Forest, nothing that explained the growing knot in his stomach. The blue Honda sat alone in the gravel parking area, dew covering the windshield like a shroud. Robert pulled on his latex gloves, a habit his colleagues mocked as CSI bullshit, and approached the vehicle. The doors were locked, nothing visible on the seats except a half-empty water bottle and a phone charger cord. He cupped his hands against the driver's side window and peered inside. Emily's purse sat on the passenger seat, undisturbed. That was wrong. Hikers didn't usually leave purses in cars, especially not young women. They took their IDs, some cash, maybe lip balm. Robert circled the vehicle, noting the tire pressure looked good, no flat that might have delayed her return. He photographed the license plate and pulled out his field notebook, a leather-bound journal his father had given him when he'd graduated forestry school. His colleagues used electronic tablets, but Robert trusted paper and ink. Oct. 15, 2019, 7:31 a.m. Vehicle present locked, personal items inside. No obvious mechanical issues. The trailhead kiosk showed the usual warnings: bear activity, stream crossing advisories, leave no trace principles. Robert signed the trail register, noting that Emily's name appeared on yesterday's log. E. Richardson, 2:15 p.m., solo hike, expected return 6 p.m. Her handwriting was neat, controlled, not the scrawl of someone nervous or rushed. The Blackwater Trail began innocently enough, a well-maintained path through second-growth pine with occasional glimpses of the creek 30 feet below. Robert moved at a steady pace, stopping every 100 yards to examine the trail for signs. His colleagues thought his tracking obsession was overkill, Martinez and his fucking footprint fetish, but attention to detail had found 3 lost hikers in the past 2 years. The morning air carried the rich scent of decomposing leaves and pine needles, occasionally punctuated by the distant sound of running water. Robert's breathing settled into the rhythm of the trail, his analytical mind cataloging observations. Deer tracks in the soft dirt, a few scuff marks from hiking boots, a discarded energy bar wrapper 20 yards off the trail, which he bagged for pack-out, leave no trace. 2 miles in, he found the first real sign. A clear boot print in a muddy section near the first creek crossing, size 8 or 9, with the distinctive waffle pattern of a hiking boot sole. The print faced uphill, toward the more challenging sections of the trail. Robert knelt and photographed it from 3 angles, then measured the length with a small ruler from his kit. 7:58 a.m. Clear boot print. Appears fresh. No water accumulation. Size estimate 8.5. Waffle sole pattern consistent with hiking boots. Facing uphill toward ridge section. The creek crossing itself showed no obvious signs of trouble. The wooden footbridge was solid, the approaches clear. But as Robert crossed, something made him pause. A smell, faint but wrong. Not the usual forest scents of pine and earth, but something metallic and sharp, like copper pennies. He knelt on the far side of the bridge and inhaled deeply, trying to identify the odor. His forestry training had covered recognizing the signs of injured wildlife. Blood had a distinctive smell that carried on morning air. But this was different. Older, more complex. Standing, Robert felt the first prickle of unease. The forest had gone quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the creek seemed muted, its usual babble reduced to a whisper. In 12 years of forest work, he'd learned to trust these moments when nature held its breath. They usually meant predator activity, a bear or mountain lion moving through the area. But as he stood listening, the silence felt different, expectant, like the forest itself was watching. Robert shook his head, disgusted with his own imagination. This was exactly the kind of thinking that made his colleagues dismiss him as the weird science guy. Facts, evidence, stick to what you can prove. The trail climbed steadily for the next mile, switchbacking up the ridge through increasingly dense forest. Robert's shirt stuck to his back despite the cool October air, and his water bottle was half empty. He paused to drink and check his GPS. 3.1 miles from the trailhead, elevation 4,147 feet. Emily should have reached this point around 3:30 p.m. yesterday. That's when he saw the second boot print. This one was different, deeper, with a longer stride pattern, as if Emily had been moving faster, or running. Robert knelt again, studying the impression. The heel was dug in hard, and there were smaller marks nearby, possibly from her catching herself after a stumble. He photographed everything, then looked ahead up the trail. 20 feet further, he found where she'd left the path. The underbrush was disturbed, small branches broken at waist height, pointing toward the dense tree line. Robert followed the trail of broken vegetation, noting bent ferns and scuff marks on tree bark. Someone had definitely gone this way, moving fast and not carefully. But why? This section of forest was thick, almost impenetrable. There was no secondary trail, no reason for a hiker to leave the maintained path. Robert pushed through the undergrowth, thorns catching on his uniform shirt, following the signs of passage. 50 yards into the trees, the trail ended at a small clearing he'd never seen before. Despite hiking this area for over a decade, the space was roughly circular, about 30 feet across, ringed by enormous pine trees that must have been growing for centuries. The ground was carpeted with fallen needles so thick they seemed to absorb sound, and in the center of the clearing stood an old stone foundation. Robert's analytical mind immediately began cataloging details. The stonework was old, probably late 1800s, with the rough-hewn blocks characteristic of frontier construction. The foundation was roughly rectangular, maybe 20 by 30 feet, large enough for a substantial cabin or small farmhouse. But there were no records of any structures this far from the main trails, no mention in any of the historical surveys he'd studied. He walked the perimeter, photographing the stonework and making notes. The stones were moss-covered and weathered, but structurally sound. This had been a solid building constructed to last, so why wasn't it on any maps? Why had he never noticed this clearing in 12 years of patrolling these trails? As he circled the foundation, Robert felt the temperature drop. Not gradually, but suddenly, like walking into a walk-in freezer. His breath began to fog, and goosebumps raced up his arms. October mornings could be cool, but this was different. This was January cold in a matter of seconds. He pulled out his digital thermometer, another piece of unnecessary equipment his colleagues mocked. The reading made him blink and check again. 34 degrees here, 20 degrees colder than the ambient forest temperature he'd measured an hour earlier. That was impossible. Local temperature variations in forest environments didn't work that way. Cold air could pool in valleys overnight, but not in elevated clearings, and not this dramatically. Robert photographed the thermometer reading, then took measurements at different points around the clearing. The temperature was consistent throughout the space, as if the entire clearing existed in a different climate zone. His scientific mind raced through possible explanations. Underground cave system creating airflow, unusual mineral composition affecting thermal properties, some kind of microclimate phenomenon he'd never encountered in his education. But as he stood in the center of the clearing, thermometer in hand, Robert felt something else. A presence. The unmistakable sensation of being watched by eyes he couldn't see. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound except the whisper of wind through pine needles. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger. The fine hairs on his neck stood up, and his mouth went dry. This was when Robert's rational mind began to war with something deeper and more primitive. His forestry training told him to document everything, collect data, find logical explanations. But some ancient part of his brain was screaming at him to run. He pulled out his camera and began photographing the clearing systematically, forcing himself to work methodically despite the growing sense of wrongness. Through the viewfinder, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. There were other paths leading away from the clearing. Faint trails through the underbrush that his naked eye had missed but were clearly visible in the camera's display. 3 of them, heading in different directions deeper into the forest. Paths that weren't there when he'd looked directly at them. Robert lowered the camera and looked again. Nothing. Just dense forest and shadows. He raised the camera. 3 distinct trails, worn smooth by years of passage. His hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. This wasn't possible. Cameras didn't see things that weren't there. Light was light, whether filtered through a lens or striking the human eye directly. There had to be an explanation, some trick of contrast or shadow that his camera's sensor was interpreting differently. But as he stood there, shifting between direct observation and camera view, Robert began to hear something else. Faint at first, almost below the threshold of perception, but growing gradually clearer. Voices. Human voices calling from somewhere deep in the forest. Too distant to make out words, but definitely human. And one of them sounded like it might be female. Emily. Robert's training warred with his growing fear. Protocol said to radio for backup, wait for additional personnel, approach unknown situations with caution. But if Emily was out there, injured and calling for help, every minute mattered. Hypothermia could kill in hours, especially with temperatures this low. He chose the trail that seemed to lead in the direction of the voices, the one that was invisible to his naked eye but clear as day through his camera viewfinder. Moving slowly, using the camera like a navigation tool, Robert pushed deeper into the forest. The voices grew stronger as he walked, definitely multiple people, though still too distant to understand. But underneath the human calls, he began to hear something else, a rhythmic sound, like chanting, rising and falling in a pattern that made his skin crawl. The trail, visible only through his camera, led downhill through increasingly ancient forest. The trees here were massive, old-growth giants that predated European settlement. Some of the pines were 8 feet in diameter, their canopy so thick it blocked most of the sunlight. Robert had to use his headlamp to navigate, the beam creating a small pool of light in what felt like perpetual twilight. His radio crackled with static, another impossibility since he was well within range of the repeater towers. He tried to call back to the station but got only white noise. His cell phone showed no signal, though this section of forest usually had at least 1 bar. The voices were closer now, and Robert could almost make out words. Definitely English, though the rhythm was strange, almost sing-song. And beneath it, that rhythmic chanting in what sounded like a different language entirely. That's when he smelled the smoke. Wood smoke, but wrong somehow. Too sweet, with an underlying chemical tang that made his eyes water. Robert had fought forest fires for 6 years before transferring to search and rescue. He knew the smell of burning pine, oak, even the acrid scent of burning man-made materials. This was different. Organic, but corrupted. Through the trees ahead, he could see a faint orange glow. Fire, but controlled. A campfire or bonfire, which made no sense this deep in the wilderness. No camping was allowed off designated sites, and certainly not in old-growth areas. Robert moved more carefully now, using trees for cover as he approached the light source. The voices were clear now, definitely human, definitely speaking English. But the words made his blood run cold. Emily Richardson, age 22, born June 15th, 1997. Someone was reading Emily's personal information, her full name, birth date, address. Details that could only have come from her driver's license or other identification, but spoken in that same sing-song rhythm, as if reciting an incantation. Robert crept closer, his rational mind trying to process what he was hearing. Had Emily been kidnapped? Was this some kind of ritual or cult activity? But how had they known she would be hiking this trail? How had they gotten her off the path and to this impossible location? The light came from a bonfire in another clearing, this one larger than the stone foundation site. Figures moved around the fire. He counted at least 6 people in dark clothing. They stood in a circle, and in the center, tied to a wooden post, was a young woman in a red jacket. Emily. Robert's training kicked in. He needed to radio for backup, establish a perimeter, assess the threat level before attempting any rescue. But his radio was dead, his cell phone useless, and Emily was clearly in immediate danger. He began working his way around the clearing's perimeter, trying to get a better view of the situation. The figures around the fire were chanting now, their voices rising and falling in unison. In the firelight, Robert could see their faces were painted or tattooed with symbols he didn't recognize, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing light. Emily appeared unconscious, her head hanging forward, but she was breathing. Robert could see her chest rising and falling, alive, for now. One of the chanting figures stepped forward, raising something in their hands. A knife, the blade catching firelight like liquid amber. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what he was witnessing. Some kind of sacrificial ritual. Every instinct screamed at him to attack, to rush the clearing and try to save Emily before they could hurt her. But 6 against 1 was suicide, especially when he had no idea what weapons they might have. And there was something else stopping him, something his rational mind refused to acknowledge. The symbols on their faces were moving, not shifting in the firelight but actually moving, flowing across their skin like living tattoos, changing shape and configuration as he watched. And their eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, glowing with an inner light that wasn't entirely human. Robert closed his eyes hard and opened them again, hoping to clear his vision. But the impossible sight remained. Whatever these people were, they weren't entirely normal. The figure with the knife began speaking, their voice carrying clearly across the clearing. But the language wasn't English anymore. It was something older, harsher, with consonant sounds that seemed to catch in the throat. And as they spoke, the temperature around Robert dropped even further. His breath came in thick clouds and frost began forming on the nearby vegetation. That's when Emily raised her head. But it wasn't Emily. The face that looked up at the knife-wielding figure was Emily's, but the expression wasn't human. The features were right. The blonde hair, the bone structure, the general shape. But the intelligence behind the eyes was alien, predatory, ancient. And when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp. Robert's worldview shattered like glass. Everything he'd built his life on, scientific observation, rational analysis, evidence-based conclusions, crumbled in an instant, because what he was seeing couldn't exist in the world he understood, couldn't be real in a universe governed by natural laws. But it was real. He was seeing it, breathing the frigid air it created, feeling the wrongness of it in every nerve. The thing wearing Emily's face spoke then in the same harsh language as the cultists, but its voice was wrong too. Multiple voices speaking in unison, as if several people were using Emily's throat at once. The cultists stepped back, some of them falling to their knees. Whatever they had been trying to summon, it wasn't going according to plan. The thing they'd bound to the post was supposed to be a victim, not this. One of the cultists screamed, a high, terrible sound that echoed through the forest. The not Emily turned toward the sound, and Robert saw its face in profile. Still Emily's features, but the skin was too pale, almost translucent, and underneath something dark moved beneath the surface like veins filled with black blood. The screaming cultist collapsed, writhing on the ground. Where the not Emily's gaze had touched him, his painted symbols began to smoke and burn. The smell was the same sweet chemical scent Robert had noticed earlier, burning human flesh. Robert's body finally unfroze, pure terror overriding his paralysis. He stumbled backward through the underbrush, no longer caring about stealth. Behind him, more screams echoed through the forest as whatever Emily had become turned its attention to the rest of the cultists. But as he ran, crashing through branches and thorns, Robert heard something that stopped his heart. Emily's voice, but speaking in perfect normal English. Robert Martinez, Cascade Forest Service, badge number 4471. It knew his name, his badge number, personal information that Emily Richardson had never possessed. Robert ran harder, his lungs burning in the frigid air. Behind him, the screaming had stopped, replaced by something worse. Laughter. Multiple voices laughing in harmony, but with nothing human in the sound. He burst from the forest back onto the main trail, his GPS unit showing he was somehow 3 miles from where he'd entered the trees. Impossible. He hadn't walked that far, but the familiar landmarks were there. The second creek crossing, the switchback section leading back toward the trailhead. Robert stumbled down the trail, his rational mind trying to process what he'd witnessed. Mass hallucination? Some kind of psychological break brought on by stress and isolation? But the GPS coordinates were real. His photographs were real. The scratches on his arms from the thorns were real. And deep in the forest behind him, something that looked like Emily Richardson was still laughing. His radio crackled back to life as he reached the first creek crossing. Dispatch calling his unit, routine check-in protocols. Robert stared at the handset, trying to figure out what to report. That he'd found a missing hiker possessed by some kind of demonic entity. That cultists in the Cascade National Forest were conducting human sacrifices. Unit 12, respond please. You're 1020? Robert keyed the mic with shaking fingers. Unit 12, approximately 2 miles south of Blackwater Trailhead. Continuing search for missing hiker. What else could he say? Who would believe him? He made it back to the parking lot in record time, his white Ford Ranger sitting exactly where he'd left it. Emily's blue Honda was still there too, still locked, still normal, as if nothing had happened. But as Robert approached his vehicle, he noticed something that made his knees weak. Fresh footprints in the gravel. Size 8 hiking boots with a waffle sole pattern, leading away from Emily's Honda toward the tree line. Except these prints were wrong. They were too deep, as if made by someone impossibly heavy, and they glowed faintly in the morning sunlight like phosphorescent algae. Robert followed the glowing trail with his eyes, watching it disappear into the forest on the opposite side of the parking area. In the direction of the main highway, toward town. He pulled out his cell phone with trembling fingers and dialed the Richardson residence. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Hello? Mrs. Richardson? This is Ranger Martinez. I wanted to let you know. Emily just called in. She's fine. Spent the night with friends. Forgot to charge her phone. She's on her way home now. The lie came easily, automatically, because what was the alternative? Tell a grieving mother that her daughter had been possessed by something inhuman and was now walking toward town with glowing footprints. Oh, thank God. Susan Richardson sobbed with relief. Thank you so much for looking for her. I was so worried. Just glad she's safe, Robert managed. Take care. He hung up and stared at the glowing footprints leading toward the highway, toward populated areas, toward Emily's family. Robert Martinez had been a man of science for 34 years. He'd believed in evidence and rational explanations, in the comforting predictability of natural law. But as he sat in his government vehicle, watching impossible footprints fade in the morning sunlight, he realized that some things couldn't be explained away. Some things could only be survived. And sometimes, survival meant living with the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more terrible than anyone wanted to believe. He started his engine and drove slowly toward town, watching for a young woman in a red jacket walking along the highway, hoping he wouldn't find her, but knowing, with the terrible certainty of a man whose worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of 3 hours, that Emily Richardson was coming home, and she was bringing something with her. The coffee was still warm in Robert Chen's hands when his radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., shattering the peaceful morning routine he'd been savoring with his wife Maya and 7-year-old daughter Lily. Steam rose from his world's best dad mug, a Father's Day gift Lily had picked out herself. As the static-filled voice of dispatch pulled him from the domestic sanctuary he'd built over 15 years of marriage. Unit 7, we have a code yellow. Missing hiker, female, age 19. Last seen yesterday evening near Devil's Backbone Trail. Family's been calling all night. The urgency in Supervisor Martinez's voice cut through the kitchen's warmth like a blade, and Robert felt his stomach tighten with the familiar dread that came with search and rescue calls. Maya looked up from buttering Lily's toast, her dark eyes already reflecting the worry she tried to hide whenever his radio went off. "How long will you be gone?" she asked softly, though they both knew the answer could range from hours to days, depending on what the forest decided to reveal. "Daddy, you promised to help me with my science project tonight," Lily said, syrup dripping from her fork as she paused mid-bite. The autumn light streaming through their kitchen window caught the highlights in her black hair, the same color as Robert's, though hers still held the silk of childhood where his was beginning to show gray at the temples. Robert knelt beside his daughter's chair, the weight of his duty belt familiar against his hip. "I'll be back before bedtime, sweetheart. That's a promise." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, committing the moment to memory the way he always did before heading into the unknown depths of Olympic National Forest. The missing girl's name was Brittany Morrison, 19 years old, a sophomore at University of Washington who'd driven up from Seattle for what her roommate described as a spiritual retreat weekend. She'd been staying at Pine Ridge Campground, planning to spend 3 days hiking alone and finding herself among the old-growth cedars and Douglas firs that had stood sentinel in these mountains for centuries. Robert's GPS showed her last known location as mile marker 3.2 on Devil's Backbone Trail, where her car, a red 2015 Honda Civic with a faded Coexist bumper sticker, sat abandoned in the gravel pullout. Her parents, driving up from Portland through the night, had called the ranger station 17 times since midnight, their voices growing more desperate with each unanswered ring. The October air bit at Robert's cheeks as he climbed out of his F-150 at the trailhead, his breath visible in the 42-degree morning. His boots, Danner hiking boots he'd owned for 8 years, resoled twice, crunched on frost-brittle leaves as he shouldered his pack. 60 pounds of emergency gear, first aid kit, rope, emergency blanket, water purification tablets, and the Garmin GPS that had guided him through countless searches over his 12 years as a forest ranger. "Brittany," he called, his voice echoing off the granite cliffs that gave Devil's Backbone its name. The forest absorbed his shout like a hungry mouth, giving nothing back but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a Steller's jay. The trail wound upward through a cathedral of trees, their trunks disappearing into morning mist that clung to the mountainside like cobwebs. Robert's radio crackled with updates from other search teams. Rangers Patterson and Williams were covering the eastern slopes, while the volunteer SR unit from Port Angeles was working the river valleys to the south. But something about this search felt different, a wrongness that settled in Robert's gut like ice water. At mile marker 2.8, he found Brittany's first piece of gear, a blue North Face water bottle lying beside the trail, its contents still half full. Robert bagged it according to protocol, photographing its position with his department-issued camera before continuing upward. The discovery should have felt encouraging, a breadcrumb leading toward the missing girl, but instead it amplified the sense that something in these woods was fundamentally off. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Robert's situation? Comment below. The trail forked at mile marker 3.7, just past where Brittany's car had been found. To the left, the main path continued toward Mount Storm King's summit. To the right, a fainter track led through dense forest toward what Robert's topographical map labeled as Clearwater Mine, abandoned 1952. The secondary trail showed signs of recent passage, broken branches at shoulder height, boot prints in soft earth that looked fresh despite the morning frost. Robert keyed his radio. Unit 7 to base, found possible track leading toward Old Clearwater Mine, following for reconnaissance. Martinez's response crackled back immediately. Copy that, Unit 7. Proceed with caution. That area's been closed to public access since 2010. The trail descended through increasingly dense forest, old-growth cedar giving way to younger Douglas fir and hemlock that blocked out more and more of the morning sky. Robert's handheld GPS showed him moving into what the locals called the dead zone, a valley where cell service died completely and radio signals grew unreliable. He'd been through this area before, always with a partner, always with a sense that they were walking through a place that didn't welcome human presence. 20 minutes down the secondary trail, Robert found Brittany's hiking boots. They sat side by side on a moss-covered log, laces still tied, as if she'd simply decided to walk barefoot through the October forest. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs as he photographed the boots from multiple angles, noting the wear patterns on the soles and the University of Washington Huskies keychain attached to the left boot's top eyelet. These weren't boots that had fallen off during a struggle or a fall. They'd been removed deliberately, carefully, and left as a message. "Brittany Morrison!" Robert shouted, his voice hoarse with growing desperation. "If you can hear me, call out. Your parents are looking for you." The forest swallowed his words completely, not even bothering to return an echo. The abandoned Clearwater mine emerged from the forest like a wound in the earth. What had once been a thriving copper extraction operation in the 1940s now lay scattered across a small clearing. Rusted machinery, collapsed wooden structures, and the dark mouth of the mine shaft itself, sealed with a heavy steel grate that bore warnings in multiple languages about toxic gases and unstable tunnels. But it was the other structures that made Robert's skin crawl. Someone, or something, had built additions to the original mine buildings using materials scavenged from the forest. Crude shelters constructed from cedar branches, aluminum sheeting, and tattered blue tarps created a makeshift compound that looked like it had grown organically from the decay of the original mining operation. The smell hit him first. A mixture of human waste, rotting food, and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him of flowers left too long in a closed room. Robert drew his service weapon, a Glock 22 he'd carried for 5 years but never fired outside of quarterly qualifications, and approached the largest structure. His radio had gone completely silent, not even static, as if the batteries had died despite showing full charge when he'd left the trailhead. "Hello?" he called softly, not wanting to alert potential inhabitants, but desperate to find any trace of Brittany Morrison. "Brittany, are you here?" The door to the main shack hung open on improvised hinges, revealing an interior that defied comprehension. The walls were covered with symbols carved into the wood, not random graffiti, but deliberate markings that formed patterns Robert's rational mind refused to process. Candles melted into bizarre shapes covered every surface. Their wax pooled and hardened into formations that looked almost organic, like bone or tissue. And everywhere, photographs. Hundreds of them, tacked to the walls in overlapping layers. But these weren't normal photographs. They showed the forest itself, the same locations Robert had hiked through countless times, but wrong somehow. Trees bent at impossible angles, shadows falling in directions that defied the sun's position, and in many of the images, human figures that seemed to fade in and out of focus, as if the camera couldn't quite capture their true form. Robert's hands shook as he examined the photos more closely. Several showed the exact trail he'd followed to reach this place. But in the images, the path led not to the mine, but to structures that weren't there, or weren't there yet. Buildings that looked like they'd been constructed from human bones, clearings filled with standing stones that definitely weren't part of Olympic National Forest's geography. In the corner of the shack, Brittany's backpack sat unopened. Robert approached it like a bomb that might detonate, his heart hammering so hard he could feel his pulse in his temples. The pack, a red REI hiking backpack that matched the description given by Brittany's roommate, contained everything a responsible hiker would carry. Extra clothes, first aid kit, water purification tablets, trail mix, and a journal filled with entries about finding peace in nature and escaping the stress of college life. The final entry, dated yesterday, made Robert's blood freeze. Found the most amazing place about 2 miles off Devil's Backbone. Looks like an old mine, but there are other structures here too, almost like someone's been living here for years. The energy is incredible. I can feel something ancient and powerful in this place. Going to spend the night here and really connect with whatever spirits inhabit this land. Robert's radio suddenly burst to life with Martinez's voice. "All units, we have the Morrison family arriving at base camp. They're demanding updates on search progress. Unit 7, what's your status?" "Unit 7 to base," Robert replied, his voice barely steady. "Found subject's backpack at abandoned Clearwater mine. Requesting immediate backup and crime scene unit. This location shows signs of long-term habitation by unknown individuals." The response was buried in static, as if something was actively interfering with radio transmission. Robert caught fragments. "Copy that. Sending backup. ETA unknown. Be careful." Then silence. Robert stuffed Brittany's journal into his own pack and shouldered her backpack as evidence. Whatever had happened to the missing girl, it had started here in this compound of improvised shelters and disturbing artwork. But as he turned to leave, movement in his peripheral vision froze him in place. Through the shack's single window he could see into the forest beyond, and the forest was moving. Not the natural sway of trees in wind, but deliberate movement, as if the trees themselves were repositioning, blocking paths and creating new ones. The trail he'd followed to reach the mine was no longer visible, replaced by dense undergrowth that looked like it had been growing undisturbed for decades. Robert ran. He burst from the shack and sprinted toward where the trail should have been, but found only impenetrable forest. His GPS spun wildly, showing his location as shifting between the mine, the main trail, and coordinates that placed him miles from any known landmarks. The device finally displayed signal lost in red letters before the screen went completely black. Behind him, footsteps. Not the heavy boots of a fellow ranger or the careful tread of a lost hiker, but something else. Feet moving across the forest floor with a rhythm that didn't quite match human gait. Robert spun around, weapon raised, and saw nothing but the abandoned mine buildings. But the sound continued, circling him just beyond the edge of vision, always staying in his peripheral awareness where details remained frustratingly unclear. "Who's there?" Robert shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Brittany, is that you?" The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Robert became aware of other wrongness. No bird songs, no insect sounds, no wind through the trees. The forest had gone completely dead, as if every living thing except him and whatever was making those footsteps had simply vanished. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the hammer of his heart against his ribs. Then, from somewhere deeper in the mine complex, he heard singing. A woman's voice, young and clear, carrying a melody he almost recognized. Something that might have been a hymn or a lullaby, but with words in a language that predated English. The voice was definitely human, definitely female, and definitely not Brittany Morrison. This singer had been practicing her craft for much longer than 19 years. Robert followed the voice deeper into the compound, past structures that seemed to grow more elaborate and disturbing the further he went from the main trail. Buildings constructed from materials that hadn't come from any hardware store, walls that looked like they'd been woven from human hair, support beams that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to vertebrae, and roofing made from what appeared to be leather, but couldn't possibly be animal hide. The singing grew louder, joined by other voices. A chorus of women singing in harmony, their melody weaving through the forest like fog. Robert's rational mind cataloged possible explanations. Cultists, squatters, a religious group that had claimed the abandoned mine as their sanctuary. But his gut knew better. Whatever lived in this place had been here much longer than the mine, much longer than white settlement of the Pacific Northwest. The voices led him to a structure that defied architectural logic. A building that seemed to exist partially underground and partially suspended in the air, supported by tree branches that had grown through its walls and become structural elements. Through windows made from pieces of glass arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, Robert could see movement inside. Women in white dresses, dancing. Their movements were coordinated but wrong, like a ballet choreographed by someone who had never seen human dancing but had been told about it secondhand. They spun and leapt with grace that suggested years of practice, but their gestures included motions no human joints should have been able to achieve. And in the center of their dance, Brittany Morrison sat perfectly still. She was alive. Robert could see her chest rising and falling with breath. but her eyes were closed and her face held an expression of absolute peace that looked more like death than sleep. The dancers moved around her in increasingly complex patterns, their white dresses billowing with each turn, their faces showing emotions that had no names in any human language. Robert raised his weapon and approached the building's entrance, a doorway framed with carved symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "Federal law enforcement," he shouted, falling back on protocol even though he knew it was useless. "Release the girl and come out with your hands visible." The dancing stopped instantly. 20 faces turned toward the windows in perfect unison, and Robert got his first clear look at Brittany's captors. They were women, or had been once. But time and whatever lived in this place had changed them into something else. Their skin held the waxy pallor of mushrooms that grew in caves. Their hair moved with its own wind, and their eyes reflected light like animals' eyes, showing depths that went much further back than any human skull could contain. The one in the center, clearly the leader wearing a white dress that might have been a wedding gown decades ago, smiled at Robert with teeth that had been filed to points. When she spoke, her voice carried the same melody as the singing, turning words into music that made Robert's bones ache. "You've come for the girl," she said, her accent suggesting origins in no earthly region. "But she came to us willingly, seeking the spirits of this place. We have given her what she sought, communion with forces older than your civilization's memory." "Let her go," Robert said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Behind the rifle sight, he could see Brittany more clearly now. Her lips were moving silently as if she was speaking to someone he couldn't see, and her hands gestured in patterns that matched the carved symbols covering the building's walls. "She cannot leave," the leader continued, stepping closer to the window with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. "She has drunk from our well, eaten of our bread, learned our songs. She belongs to this place now, as we all do." Robert's radio suddenly exploded with static, then cleared to reveal Maya's voice. Rob, can you hear me? Lily's science project is ready to show you. She says she can't sleep until you see what she made. Please come home." The message was impossible. Maya didn't have access to his radio frequency, and civilian calls couldn't break through on emergency channels. But her voice was absolutely clear, absolutely real, speaking words that tugged at his heart like fishing hooks. "That's not real," he said aloud, as much to convince himself as to address the woman in white. "My wife can't reach me on this frequency." "Reality," the woman replied, "is more flexible in places where the barriers have grown thin. Your family calls to you across the void, but the girl has already answered our call. Which voice will you choose to follow?" Behind her, the other dancers began moving again, their white dresses creating patterns that hypnotized and confused. Robert found his weapon wavering, his attention drifting between Brittany's still form and the impossible beauty of the dance surrounding her. The music, if it could be called music, wrapped around his thoughts like silk, offering rest and peace and an end to the constant worry that came with loving people who could be lost. Maya's voice came through the radio again. "Rob, where are you? Lily's crying. She thinks you're not coming home." Robert closed his eyes, gripping his weapon tighter, and thought about the promises he'd made. The promise to Lily that he'd be home for bedtime. The promise to Maya that he'd always find his way back to their kitchen table. The promise to Brittany's parents that he'd bring their daughter home safely. When he opened his eyes, the dancers had moved closer to the windows, their faces now pressed against the glass like pale flowers blooming in a greenhouse. Their expressions showed hunger, not for food, but for something much more essential. They wanted his attention, his belief, his willingness to accept their version of reality over the one he'd built with his family. "Brittany," Robert called, ignoring the supernatural women and focusing on the still figure in the center of their circle. "Brittany Morrison, can you hear me? Your parents are looking for you. They drove all night to find you." For the first time since he'd spotted her, Brittany's eyes opened. They were her own eyes, brown, young, frightened, not the reflective depths of her captors. She looked around the circle of dancers with growing confusion, as if she was waking from a dream she couldn't quite remember. When her gaze found Robert through the window, relief flooded her features. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly through the glass. I can't remember how I got here. They kept singing and I just wanted to listen." The woman in white hissed like an angry cat, her beautiful face contorting into something decidedly inhuman. "She has heard our songs, learned our dances, shared our feast. The claiming has been completed. You cannot undo what has been bound by ancient law." Robert had no idea what ancient law she was referring to, but he knew federal law, and he knew the laws of human decency. "I'm taking her home," he said, moving toward the building's entrance. "Stand aside." The dancers blocked his path, their white dresses billowing as they formed a wall of fabric and flesh between him and Brittany. Up close, Robert could see details that his mind had refused to process from a distance. Their dresses were made from material that moved and pulsed like skin. Their hair contained threads of what looked like spider silk, and their jewelry was crafted from small bones arranged in patterns that suggested mathematical precision rather than human aesthetics. "You would challenge us for one girl?" the leader asked, her voice now containing harmonics that made Robert's teeth ache. "We have been guardians of this place since before your people came to these mountains. We have taken only what was offered freely, harmed only those who sought to harm us. Will you break this peace for one confused child?" "Yes," Robert said without hesitation. Behind the supernatural women, Brittany was struggling to stand, her movements unsteady as if she was fighting against invisible restraints. "That's what I do. That's what I promised her parents. That's what I promised my own family. I bring people home." The woman in white studied him for a long moment, her head tilted at an angle that suggested neck bones arranged differently than human anatomy. Finally, she smiled, an expression that held no warmth but carried grudging respect. "Very well," she said. "But know that challenges issued in this place carry consequences beyond your understanding. If you would claim the girl, you must prove your worth according to the old ways." The forest around the compound began to change. Trees that had stood for centuries twisted into new configurations, their trunks bending like rubber to create a maze of living walls. The ground beneath Robert's feet shifted and flowed, paths appearing and disappearing as the landscape rearranged itself according to rules that had nothing to do with geology or physics. "Find your way to the heart of our domain," the woman commanded, her voice now echoing from multiple directions as the other dancers faded into the shifting forest. "Retrieve the girl if you can, but know that many have accepted this challenge, and none have returned to tell of what they found." Robert found himself standing alone in a corridor of twisted trees, his radio dead, his GPS useless, with only his service weapon and the knowledge that somewhere in this supernatural maze, Brittany Morrison was waiting for rescue. Behind him, the compound had vanished completely, replaced by forest that looked like it had never known human presence. Maya's voice whispered through the trees. "Rob, please come home. We need you." Lily's voice joined her mother's. "Daddy, where are you? I made something special for you." But from ahead, deeper in the maze, came Brittany's voice. "Help me, please. I remember now. I remember what they want to do." Robert chose forward, following the sound of a frightened girl's voice deeper into a forest that had stopped obeying natural laws. Each step took him further from the familiar world of radio protocols and topographical maps, further into a place where love and duty were the only navigation tools that mattered. The maze seemed to read his thoughts, creating obstacles designed specifically to break his resolve. Paths that led to clearings where holographic projections showed Maya and Lily in danger, calling for his help from home. Sounds of his daughter crying echoed from false trails, while his wife's voice pleaded with him to abandon the search and return to his family. But Robert had spent 12 years in search and rescue, 12 years learning to distinguish between genuine distress calls and the false echoes that mountains and forests could create. The voices calling him away from Brittany held the hollow quality of recordings, while her pleas for help carried the raw desperation of someone genuinely in terror. He followed that desperation through passages that defied three-dimensional geometry, past trees that whispered in languages predating human speech, over streams that flowed uphill and under rock formations that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. His watch had stopped working hours ago, his sense of direction was completely lost, and his water bottle was nearly empty. But he could still hear Brittany calling for help. The heart of the domain turned out to be a clearing that contained no structures at all. Just a circle of ancient trees surrounding a pool of water so perfectly still, it might have been black glass. Brittany sat beside the pool, no longer guarded by the dancing women but clearly unable to leave on her own. Her feet were submerged in the dark water, and with each passing moment, more of her seemed to fade, as if the pool was slowly erasing her from reality. "Mr. Chen?" she said, recognizing him despite his civilian clothes and the supernatural chaos of the past several hours. "I remember you from the safety presentation at the campground. I'm so sorry. I thought this place was beautiful, but they won't let me leave." Robert knelt beside the pool, studying the water that held Brittany's feet. It wasn't water at all, but something denser, darker, that moved with purposeful currents despite the absolute stillness of its surface. Whatever this substance was, it was connected to the supernatural women and their claim on anyone who drank from their well. "Can you lift your feet out?" Robert asked, though he suspected the answer would be no. "I've been trying for hours," Brittany said, tears streaming down her face. "Every time I pull, it gets harder, and I can feel myself forgetting things. My parents' faces, my friends' names, why I wanted to leave college. It's like I'm disappearing from the inside out." Robert had no training for supernatural rescue operations, no protocols for extracting victims from otherworldly substances. But he had rope, and he had determination, and he had made promises to people who were counting on him. "I'm going to pull you out," he said, uncoiling the climbing rope from his pack. "It might hurt, but I need you to help me as much as you can." He fashioned a harness around Brittany's torso and braced himself against the nearest tree. The first pull felt like trying to lift a car, not because Brittany was heavy, but because the pool actively resisted his efforts, the dark substance gripping her feet like living quicksand. "Think about your parents," Robert said, straining against the rope. "Think about why you came to college, what you want to do with your life. Don't let this place take those memories." Brittany closed her eyes and pulled with everything she had, fighting against the pool's supernatural suction. With a sound like tearing fabric, her left foot came free, then her right, and suddenly they were both falling backward, as the resistance vanished completely. The pool began to boil. Dark tendrils rose from its surface like angry snakes, reaching for Brittany with obvious intent. Robert grabbed her hand and ran, crashing through the circle of ancient trees as the clearing erupted behind them, with sounds that had no name in any human language. The maze was collapsing, paths disappearing even as they ran through them, the supernatural architecture unraveling without the pool's power to maintain it. Robert's GPS suddenly came back online, showing their position as rapidly moving toward the main trail, though he couldn't see any familiar landmarks through the chaos of falling trees and shifting ground. They emerged onto Devil's Backbone Trail, exactly where Brittany's car was parked, gasping and shaking but alive. Robert's radio burst into life with Martinez's voice. "Unit 7, what's your status? We lost your signal for 6 hours. 6 hours. Robert checked his watch and found it working again, showing 4:17 p.m. The entire supernatural encounter, the maze, the pool, the dancing women, had lasted only 6 hours in the real world, though it had felt like days. "Unit 7 to base," Robert replied, his voice hoarse from exertion. "Subject located and recovered. Requesting immediate medical evaluation and transport to hospital. Also requesting crime scene unit for abandoned Clearwater mine. Evidence of illegal habitation and possible cult activity." Brittany was already calling her parents on her recovered cell phone, crying with relief as she heard their voices. Robert let her have that moment while he gathered her scattered gear and tried to process what had actually happened in the forest that day. The official report would mention finding Brittany disoriented near the abandoned mine, suffering from exposure and mild dehydration. It would note evidence of transient occupation at the site and recommend increased security patrols. It would not mention dancing women in white dresses, pools that erased memories, or forests that rearrange themselves according to supernatural laws. But that night, as Robert sat at his kitchen table helping Lily with her science project, a diorama about the water cycle that she'd built with painstaking 7-year-old precision, he understood something fundamental about the balance between duty and love. The supernatural women had offered him escape from worry, from the constant fear that came with caring deeply about people who could be lost. They had offered peace in exchange for abandoning those who depended on him. He had chosen love instead, chosen the beautiful burden of caring for his family, for missing hikers, for anyone who called for help in the darkness. Maya brought him coffee in his favorite mug, kissing the top of his head the way he'd kissed Lily that morning. "Rough day?" she asked, noting the scratches on his hands and the exhaustion in his eyes. "Found her," Robert said simply. "Brought her home, through the kitchen window." The Olympic Mountains stood dark against the sunset, hiding their secrets in forests that held more than trees and wildlife. But Robert's house was warm, his family was safe, and somewhere in Portland, Brittany Morrison was sleeping in her own bed surrounded by people who loved her. In the end, that was the only magic that mattered. Holy smokes, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to Brittany in that pool. I read every single one. The Clearwater mine was permanently sealed by the National Park Service 3 weeks later, citing geological instability and public safety concerns. No further disappearances have been reported on Devil's Backbone Trail, though hikers occasionally mention hearing distant singing in languages they don't recognize, and park rangers sometimes find white flowers growing in perfect circles where no flowers should bloom. Rick Brennan adjusted his new park ranger cap for the third time in 10 minutes, the unfamiliar weight still bothering him after just 2 weeks on the job. The October air carried that crisp bite that meant winter wasn't far behind, and the scent of decaying leaves mixed with pine needles filled his nostrils as he checked his GPS coordinates one more time. Latitude 35.6532, longitude 835072, Cataract Falls Trail, mile marker 3.2. His radio crackled with static. "Brennan, you copy? This is dispatch." "Copy, dispatch, Brennan here." He fumbled with the unfamiliar radio controls, still getting used to the equipment protocols in the Smokies. Back in Colorado, everything had been different. "We've got a missing hiker report coming in. 22-year-old female Stephanie Morrison. Last seen on your trail around 1400 hours. Family's getting worried." Rick glanced at his Timex, 4:47 p.m. The sun was already casting long shadows through the dense canopy of sugar maples and oak trees. He'd been patrolling this section of trail all afternoon, and he was pretty sure he'd seen everyone who'd come through. There'd been the elderly couple with matching hiking poles, the guy with the expensive camera gear, and... wait. His stomach dropped as the memory hit him like a physical blow. There had been a young woman, blonde hair in a ponytail, blue North Face jacket, hiking boots that looked barely broken in. She'd been sitting on the wooden bridge over the creek taking selfies with an iPhone that caught the afternoon light. He'd waved. She'd waved back. And then... "Dispatch, I think I might have seen her." Rick's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Blonde, early 20s, blue jacket?" "That's affirmative. Can you retrace your steps? Family says she should have been back to the parking lot by now." Rick was already moving, his heavy boots crunching on the leaf-littered trail, the familiar weight of his backpack, water, first aid kit, emergency radio, flares, felt reassuring against his shoulders. But something else was nagging at him. Something about that moment when he'd seen Stephanie on the bridge. He'd waved, she'd waved back, and then he'd looked down at his trail map for maybe 30 seconds to mark his position. And when he'd looked up, she'd been gone. Not walking away. Not heading up or down the trail. Just gone. "Jesus," he muttered, picking up his pace. The trail wound through dense forest here, with visibility limited to maybe 50 feet in any direction. Easy to lose someone, easy to miss a turnoff. easy to disappear. His radio squawked again. "Brennan, you there?" "Yeah, I'm heading back to the last known position now, bridge over Cascade Creek." "Copy that. We're sending backup, but you're closest. Standard search protocol. Stay on designated trails. Mark your position every 15 minutes. Maintain radio contact." Standard search protocol. Rick had memorized the manual, but 2 weeks wasn't enough time to really know the terrain. Not like the veterans who'd been working these mountains for decades, who knew every deer path and hidden ravine. The bridge came into view through the trees, and Rick's pace slowed. Everything looked exactly the same. The weathered wooden planks, the creek bubbling maybe 8 feet below, the moss-covered rocks. But the emptiness felt wrong somehow, like a photograph with something important erased. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I'm at the bridge. No sign of the missing hiker. Any tracks? Disturbed vegetation?" Rick knelt on the wooden planks where he'd seen Stephanie sitting. The wood was dry, no wet spots from someone's wet hiking boots, no scuff marks, no dropped gum wrapper or hair tie that might have indicated someone was here recently. But he'd seen her. He was sure he'd seen her. "Negative on obvious signs," he reported, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. "I'm going to expand the search area." The trail continued another half-mile to a scenic overlook, then looped back through what the maps called the Whispering Pines section. Rick had never been up there. It wasn't part of his regular patrol route yet. As a newcomer, he was still learning the mountain's geography, still figuring out which trails connected where. His boots found their rhythm on the gradually climbing path. The sound of the creek faded behind him, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a crow. The temperature was dropping fast now that the sun was getting low, and he zipped his Forest Service jacket up to his neck. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Rick stopped, listening. The forest had that particular quality of sound that experienced rangers learned to read. The difference between wind moving through branches and something large pushing through undergrowth. "Hello?" he called out. "Stephanie? This is Park Service." Movement flickered between the trees maybe 30 yards off the trail. A flash of blue that could have been a jacket. Rick's pulse quickened. "Stephanie Morrison? I'm Ranger Brennan with the Park Service. Your family's looking for you." The blue shape moved again, deeper into the trees, away from him. This was against protocol. Stay on designated trails. But if that was Stephanie, and she was disoriented or injured, Rick pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I think I've got visual on the missing hiker. She's approximately 30 yards west of the Cataract Falls Trail, about a quarter-mile north of Cascade Creek Bridge. I'm going to attempt contact. Brennan, stay on the trail. We've got additional units." The radio cut to static. Rick looked at the display, full bars but no signal getting through. He tapped the side of the radio, tried different channels. Nothing but white noise. Great. 2 weeks on the job and his equipment was already failing him. The blue shape was moving farther away. Rick made his decision. He marked his GPS position, pulled out his whistle and gave 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for need assistance, then pushed into the undergrowth. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Rick's situation? Comment below. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves that muffled his footsteps, but also made it impossible to move quietly. Branches caught at his jacket, and spiderwebs stretched across his face as he pushed through areas that clearly hadn't seen human traffic in months. "Stephanie," he called again. "Please stop. I'm here to help." A voice answered from ahead of him, faint and distorted by the trees. "Help, please." Rick's training kicked in. Injured hiker, possible hypothermia or dehydration. He picked up his pace, pushing through a stand of young maples toward the sound. He emerged into a small clearing where the canopy opened up enough to let in the fading daylight. And there she was, blonde ponytail, blue North Face jacket, sitting on a fallen log with her back to him, shoulders shaking like she was crying or shivering. "Stephanie? Hey, it's okay. I'm Ranger Brennan." Rick approached slowly, the way he'd been trained. "Keep your voice calm. Don't startle someone who might be in shock. Your family's worried about you. Are you hurt? She didn't turn around. Stephanie. Rick walked around the fallen log to face her, and his blood turned to ice water. The face looking back at him wasn't Stephanie Morrison. It was an older woman, maybe 60, with gray hair that definitely hadn't been blonde an hour ago. She was wearing the same blue jacket, but it hung loose on her smaller frame. Who are you? Rick's voice came out as barely a whisper. The woman smiled, and Rick noticed that her teeth were too white, too perfect, like dentures that didn't quite fit right. I'm Stephanie Morrison, she said in a voice that was definitely not the voice that had called for help. My family's looking for me. Rick stumbled backward, his hand instinctively going to his radio, but the radio was just static, and his GPS was showing an error message, and the sun seemed to have moved farther than it should have in just a few minutes. No, he said, shaking his head. No, that's not. You're not. The woman stood up from the log, and Rick realized she was taller than she'd seemed sitting down. Taller than Stephanie had been on the bridge. Taller than should have been possible. Is there a problem, Ranger Brennan? She asked, and her voice was changing as she spoke, getting younger, higher. I'm just a lost hiker who needs your help. Rick turned and ran. He crashed through the forest without any sense of direction, branches whipping at his face, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it over his ragged breathing. Behind him, he could hear something following. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of undergrowth being disturbed by something that moved differently than a human should. A voice called after him, and now it sounded exactly like Stephanie Morrison's voice from the bridge. Ranger Brennan, please don't leave me. Rick didn't stop running until he burst out of the tree line and found himself back on the Cataract Falls trail. He bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath and make sense of what had just happened. His radio crackled back to life. Brennan, come in. What's your status? Rick grabbed the radio with shaking hands. Dispatch, there's something wrong out here. I found someone, but it wasn't the missing hiker. Copy that. Can you describe what you found? How could he describe what he'd found? A woman wearing Stephanie's clothes who changed height and age while he watched? A voice that shifted like someone adjusting a radio dial? I think someone's playing games out here, he said finally. Maybe trying to interfere with the search. Understood. We've got 3 units en route to your position. Stay on the trail and wait for backup. Rick checked his GPS. He was exactly where he'd started, at the bridge over Cascade Creek. According to the timestamp, he'd been in the woods for 11 minutes, but it felt like it had been much longer. The sun was setting fast now, painting the creek water orange and red. In maybe 30 minutes it would be full dark, and searching would become exponentially more dangerous. Footsteps on the trail made him turn around. A man in a Park Service uniform was walking toward him, and Rick felt a flood of relief. Finally, backup. Someone who knew these mountains, who could help him make sense of what was happening. You Brennan? The man called out as he approached. I'm Ranger Coleman. Got the call about a missing hiker. Rick studied the approaching figure. Mid-40s, graying beard, the kind of weathered face that came from decades working outdoors. His uniform looked properly broken in, unlike Rick's stiff new gear. Yeah, that's me. Listen, Coleman, there's something weird going on out here. I found someone in the woods, but they weren't who they claimed to be. Coleman nodded seriously. Yeah, we get that sometimes. Homeless folks, drug users. Sometimes they hole up in the backcountry and mess with hikers. Did you get a good look at them? Something was bothering Rick about this conversation, but he couldn't put his finger on what. It was a woman, older, but she was wearing the missing hiker's clothes, and she knew the missing hiker's name. Huh. Coleman pulled out a notepad and started writing. What time was this? Maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, just north of here, maybe a quarter mile into the woods. Coleman's pen stopped moving. North of here? You mean in the Whispering Pines section? I guess. I'm still learning the area names. Coleman looked up from his notepad, and Rick noticed his eyes were a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in the fading light. Brennan, there is no Whispering Pines section. Never has been. And the trail doesn't go north from here. It goes east to the overlook, then loops back south. Rick felt the forest floor shift under his feet. He pulled out his map, the same map he'd been using all day, and stared at it. Coleman was right. The trail was clearly marked, east to the scenic overlook, then a southern loop back to the parking area. No northern branch, no section called Whispering Pines. But I was just there, Rick said weakly. I followed someone into the woods to the north. Coleman stepped closer and Rick caught a whiff of something unpleasant. Not body odor exactly, but something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left out too long. Brennan, how long you been working these mountains? 2 weeks. Right. New guy. Coleman's smile was sympathetic, but something about it made Rick's skin crawl. Look, I've been working the Smokies for 23 years. There's no Whispering Pines section. There's no trail going north from this bridge. And there's definitely no clearing a quarter-mile through the woods where someone could be sitting on a fallen log. Rick looked back toward the tree line where he'd emerged just minutes ago. Now that Coleman mentioned it, the vegetation looked incredibly dense, almost impenetrable. Had he really crashed through all of that? I know what I saw, Rick said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm sure you do. Coleman put a hand on Rick's shoulder, and his grip was too strong, fingers digging in through the fabric of the jacket. These mountains play tricks on people, especially new people who don't know the land yet. Rick tried to step back, but Coleman's grip tightened. The thing is, Brennan, we still got a missing hiker to find, and I'm thinking maybe you should head back to the ranger station. Let the experienced guys handle this one. There was something in Coleman's tone that made Rick's danger instincts flare. This wasn't a suggestion. This was an order. And the hand on his shoulder was making it clear that refusing wasn't an option. I want to help find her, Rick said carefully. It's my responsibility. Coleman's pale eyes seemed to reflect the dying sunlight like an animal's. Your responsibility is to follow orders from senior rangers, and I'm ordering you to head back to base. Rick's radio squawked. All units, this is dispatch. We've got an update on the missing hiker situation. Both men reached for their radios at the same time, but Rick noticed something that made his blood freeze. Coleman's radio was a model that the Park Service had stopped using 5 years ago. Rick knew because he'd specifically asked about the equipment during his training. Dispatch, this is Brennan, Rick said into his radio, keeping his eyes on Coleman. Brennan, we just heard from the Morrison family. Stephanie's not missing. She made it back to her car around 1600 hours and drove home. False alarm. Rick felt like the ground had fallen out from under him. But I saw her, on the bridge, around 1400 hours. Negative, Brennan. According to her GPS tracking app, she never made it past the first mile of the trail. Turned around due to a twisted ankle. Coleman was smiling now, and his teeth were too white, too perfect, just like the woman in the woods. Looks like you had yourself quite an adventure for nothing, Coleman said. Mountain ghosts, probably. These old hills are full of them. Rick keyed his radio again, backing away from Coleman. Dispatch, can you verify the identity of Ranger Coleman? Claims to be backup, but his equipment doesn't match current service standards. Silence on the radio. Then, Brennan, we don't have any Ranger Coleman on duty today. All backup units are still 20 minutes out. Rick ran. He didn't look back to see if Coleman was following. He just ran down the trail toward the parking lot, his boots slipping on wet leaves, his breath coming in sharp bursts that burned his lungs. Behind him, he could hear laughter that didn't sound human. The parking lot came into view through the trees, and Rick had never been so happy to see asphalt and streetlights in his life. His Ford Ranger was exactly where he'd left it, and the familiar sight of his Colorado native bumper sticker felt like an anchor to reality. He fumbled with his keys, hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and Rick had the truck in reverse before he'd even put on his seatbelt. As he backed out of the parking space, his headlights swept across the trailhead sign. For just a moment, he could have sworn it read, Whispering Pines Trail instead of Cataract Falls Trail. But when he looked again, it was back to normal. Rick drove the winding mountain road back to the ranger station faster than he should have, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only real thing in the world. The radio chatter continued. Other units arriving at the trail, coordinating a search for a missing hiker who apparently had never been missing at all. When he pulled into the station parking lot, his supervisor's truck was already there. The lights were on in the office, and Rick could see Chief Ranger Martinez through the window, probably doing paperwork. Rick sat in his truck for a long moment, trying to figure out how to explain what had happened. How do you tell your boss that you spent an hour searching for someone who wasn't missing, talking to people who weren't real and finding places that didn't exist? How do you explain that you're not sure what's real anymore? His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Thanks for playing along today, Rick. See you tomorrow. See? Rick stared at the message until the screen went dark. In the reflection, he could see his own face, pale, exhausted, confused. But behind his reflection, just for a moment, he could swear he saw someone else in the truck with him, someone wearing a blue North Face jacket. He spun around, but the back seat was empty. When he looked at his phone again, the text message was gone. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Rick in the Smokies. I read every single one. Was it all in his head? Are there really shapeshifters in the mountains? What would you have done in Rick's situation? Next time you're hiking alone in the deep woods, remember Rick's story, because sometimes the biggest danger isn't getting lost. It's not being sure who you can trust to help you find your way back.